Hi there, Michael here. In last week's video, we talked about a new plugin called Danu, which allows you to convert stereo audio to 9.1.6 surround sound without affecting the stereo fold down. What's exciting about this plugin is that it lets you add an Atmos mix to an existing stereo mix in a way that ensures the stereo down mix of the Atmos track sounds 100% identical to the original stereo mix. In today's video, I want to follow up on that topic by providing more detail about how to use this plugin to create an Atmos mix and how we can do that even without access to an Atmos Studio, simply by using headphones with head tracking. I will walk you through the entire process. We will start with a completed stereo mix and we will turn it into an Atmos mix ready for submission to a distribution service such as DistroKid. This is going to be fun, so let's get started. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. Sam Hawking, the developer of Danu, is a good friend of mine and co-hosts our immersive audio podcast, Spatial Audio Monthly. If you're interested in his perspective on the plugin, I highly recommend watching my first video about Danu. I'll leave a link to that video in the description below. And as I also mentioned in my video last week, although Sam is a friend, this isn't a sponsored video. No money has or will exchange hands between us from Danu sales. But enough said, let's open up Reaper and start using Danu to turn an existing stereo track into a Dolby Atmos mix. I'm going to work with Reaper today because that's the easiest way to work with Danu, and I'm going to work on a Mac, but be aware that everything that I'm going to show you today works in Windows in exactly the same way. So if you're on Windows, you will be fine. Just follow the same steps. And what I have here is a completed stereo track. And what I did is I actually took the transcript from last week's video and fed it into a large language model and asked that large language model to create lyrics for a pop song out of that transcript. And it did. And I then took those lyrics and fed it into Suno and asked it to create a pop song. And that's what we have here. So let's have a brief listen what we've got.
Transform them to dimensions of light. Atmos takes us higher tonight, preserving the essence, making it right. Newland waves, they dance and flow, from stereo to Atmos, watch it grow. Direct and diffuse and perfect.
Now, I call this track Nulling Waves, or also the Danu song. And if you're interested in listening to the full song, I'm going to post it on my secondary channel, and you will find a link to that video in the description below. And what we want to do now is we want to take that stereo track and turn that into full Atmos. Now, the first thing that we need to take care of is the listening environment, and I'm going to work with headphones only today, and that essentially means I need some way to mimic the experience in an Atmos Studio, because as we've talked about in the previous video, Danu is a nulling up mixer, and that essentially means whatever we're going to do, we are not going to hear in the stereo fold down, because the stereo fold down is always going to null. So any changes that we're going to make in the way the audio is distributed in three-dimensional space is not going to affect the stereo fold down. So if I'm not mimicking or if I'm not virtualizing an Atmos Studio space, I'm not able to hear anything. So that's the first thing that I need to do. Now, there are a couple of different options that you have. If you're working on a Mac, for example, you can use the Apple AirPods and an appropriate plugin that is able to access the head tracking capabilities of the Apple AirPods. And one plugin that I like to use is Audiomover's Binaural Renderer. Now, the disadvantage of going that route is that the Binaural Renderer from Audiomovers requires a 7.1.4 signal, and Danu works in 9.1.6. And that essentially means that if we want to go that route, we first also have to have a plugin that can fold down from 9.1.6 to 7.1.4. So this is an option that is possible, but it's not the one that I'm going to go with today. Another option would be, if you want to use the Apple AirPods on a Mac, you could go with Ginger Audio's Ground Control Sphere. That is a standalone application, which is a virtual monitor controller, and that actually is able to take in 9.1.6 and convert it into binaural stereo with the Apple AirPods head tracked. But that is a little bit overkill, to be perfectly honest. Ground control sphere is relatively expensive, and for what we want to do today, that seems to be overkill. And most importantly, it's also only available for Mac, and I want to actually do something that is available for Windows users as well. So what I'm going to do today is something that I've done in my videos a lot in the past. I'm going to use the Subaware head tracker. The Subaware head tracker is a very neat, relatively inexpensive head tracker, and what you do is you essentially put it on top of your headphones and then connect it to your PC. And what the software that comes with the Subaware head tracker will do is it will then essentially take in the information about the position of the head and convert it into something that you can use in your digital audio workstation. So that is what we are going to use today. But first things first, before we can do anything, we need to first turn our track into a 16-channel track, because we are going to work with 9.1.6 audio. So I'm going to go into the track settings, going to change that to 16 channels. And in the same way, I'm also going to do the same thing for the master bus. So let's also turn that into 16 channels. And then I just make sure that the audio is actually also routed completely. So all 16 tracks or all 16 channels are routed from the track that holds the audio into the master bus. And then I need to set up the heads tracking. And the first thing I'm going to do for that is I'm going to start up the Bridgehead application. The Bridgehead application is a little application that comes with the Subaware head tracker. And all it really does is it takes the head tracking information that comes from the head tracker and turns that into OSC messages, which can then be read by the digital audio workstation. And with that being set up, all I need to do is need to connect my head tracker to my headphones and then to the computer. And if you have watched my channel, you know that this is a little bit fiddly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch off my camera, connect everything, and then I'm going to come back once I have the head tracker on my headphones. Okay, here we go. I've now connected the head tracker to my headphones, and the last thing I need to do is I need to connect the cable with the computer. So let's do that. So let's connect everything, and once I've connected that, I should see the connection signal coming up in the Bridgehead application. And here we are. We have the head tracking working. I can see the dummy head. Essentially, if I move my head, the dummy head is moving accordingly. I can double click this dummy head, and that will essentially kind of normalize or kind of set that back to the default position. I might need to do that once in a while. If you're working with head trackers, you know that they can drift a little. So once in a while, you probably need to kind of click here and reset everything. Now, in my particular case, because there's so much electronic interference here, that might actually happen a little more often than in your particular case. Now, the one thing I need to make sure is I need to make sure that the bridge settings are set correctly, and the profile that I need to use here is APL Virtuoso, because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use that not with the standard application or the standard binaural renderer that comes with Bridgehead. I'm actually going to use Virtuoso as my binaural rendering plugin. And with that set up, let's go back to Reaper and let's add Virtuoso as a binaural renderer. Now, I could use the binaural renderer that comes with the Subaware head tracker. However, then I'm running into the same issue that I also ran into with the Apple AirPods, and that is the binaural renderer that comes with the Subaware head tracker only goes up to 7.1.4. We actually want to have a binaural renderer that can render 9.1.6, and the best option out there is APL Virtuoso. I'm going to leave a link to that plugin in the description below. If you want to do any serious work with binaural audio, I highly recommend getting that one. It is probably the best binaural renderer that is out there, and most importantly, the most flexible binaural renderer. So let's add our binaural renderer Virtuoso to our master track, and I'm going to use the VST3 version here. That's perfectly fine, and that should open up Virtuoso. Now I need to change the input configuration to Dolby Atmos 9.1.6. There are two options here that they're slightly different speaker layouts, but they're essentially both fine for the purpose that we are using it here. So let's kind of switch that, and then I need to go into the settings, and in the settings I just need need to make sure that everything is set correctly. First of all, be aware that this is a binaural renderer, so it's going to actually change the way you actually experience the audio, simply because it's going to create a binaural downmix. When we're talking about Dano as a nulling upmix, it is only nulling the direct stereo fold down. Obviously, if you're doing a binaural rendering of that Atmos mix or of that 9.1.6, it's going to sound a little bit different, and that's going to happen here. You can choose different head-related transfer functions. Just choose the one that is most appropriate to you. If you have one, that would be perfect. You can also use your own SOFA file, which is a personalized head-related transfer function. A little difficult to get, but if you have that, great. Use that one, and then you can also mess around with the room parameters to fine-tune what you want to hear in your binaural down mix. The only thing that we need to do is we need to switch the head tracking from manual to automatic. And here in the automatic settings, we just need to make sure that the profile is set to APL Virtuoso. And once again, what we want to do is we want to just make sure that we are drifting not too much and resetting the head position. And with that, then let's just kind of play our audio. What's going to happen now is that the stereo track is going to be on channels 1 and 2. So the impressions that I'm going to get is just as a stereo file with two speakers in front of me. And if I'm moving my head to the left, for example, you're going to hear that as a panning to the right. So you're hearing exactly what I'm hearing. And with that, let's just play our audio. And once again, that works reasonably well. So for the purpose, what we want to do here, that is actually perfectly fine. Once again, we already have a completed stereo mix. So we are not really that concerned with the sound quality of the stereo mix, because we know that if we use Dano, it's actually going to upmix everything in a way that leaves the original stereo mix completely intact. So if it sounded good before we use Dano, it's going to sound good after we are going to use Dano. So the only thing that we're really concerned with is the three-dimensional image. And for that, essentially, this particular setup here is perfectly fine. We don't really need more than that. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to introduce Dano to our setup. And a lot of people have actually reached out and asked, do I need to work with the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer if I want to use Dano? Because in my last video, I showed it in connection with the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer, and we're actually going to do that today again. And the answer to the question is no, you don't. Dano is just an upmixer. So it takes in stereo and it upmixes it to 9.1.6. And what you do with that 9.1.6 is completely up to you. You could, for example, just kind of create a surround sound upmix. That's also perfectly fine. Or you can also use it with any other software that can use 9.1.6. Be aware that this causes a couple of issues if you want to use it with, for example, something like Logic, because Logic doesn't really know how to handle 9.1.6 files. Or if you want to use it with the regular Dolby Music Penner, that can also be a little bit tricky. But once again, all we're really doing is we're taking the stereo track and we're upmixing that to 9.1.6, and then we're doing something with that 9.1.6. And if you're using the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer, we can use that 9.1.6 signal in order to create a Dolby Atmos composite, which is a combination of bed channels and object channels, and that is exactly what we're going to do today. So let's just add Dano to our track, and what we want to do for that is we need to load not the Dano plugin itself, because Dano once again is a script in Pure Data, and for that to work within Reaper, what we need to do is we need to load that into another plugin, which is called Plug Data, and that plugin Plug Data is completely free. You can download that for free. I'm going to leave a link in the description below, and then we simply load that script into Plug Data. So let's add Plug Data to our track, and where we have it, here we have it, Plug Data FX. We want to use the effects version. We're going to add that. Once we open that, it asks us to open a patch. Now, I've already opened the Dano patch before, but if you have not done that, you simply click here on Open Patch, and you kind of open up wherever you've downloaded Dano, and you open that, and as soon as you've opened that, Dano is available available here. And if you now essentially save that, you never have to reload that again. It's kind of, Reaper remembers the patch that you loaded into Plug Data. So this is also one of the things that a couple of people have asked, do I have to do that every time? No, you don't. Essentially, if you now save the session, essentially everything just comes back regularly. And you could even save that as a preset, and then essentially whenever you open up that preset, it loads Plug Data already with the Dano patch applied. So let's play our audio and play around with Dano. Now, one thing I need to mention is that in the most recent version of Dano, Sam Hawking added this little button here. Now, you don't really need to know what that button is, but it's a little bit of a technicality, because it turns out that for certain digital audio workstations, you need to have a special treatment of the center and LFE channels. However, by default, this button is clicked, and if that button is clicked in Reaper, the center channel and the LFE is not showing up. So what you want to do is you want to unselect that, and as soon as I unselect it, I see the center channel here. And then I can simply do whatever I want to do with my audio. I can change the center, how much information is put into the center. And in order to get a better sense of what is actually happening, let's open up Virtuoso here, and let's maybe solo the center channel. And I probably need to, I need to kind of reset that here. So if I now want to have more signal, and let me just kind of turn the signal up a little. So if I want to have more information in the center channel, I can simply add that here, or kind of change that here. And this shape selector will allow me to change the frequency range that is essentially sent into the center channel. And that will allow you to zoom in on the vocal range, for example. So if I want to have the vocals in the center, so maybe something like here, and then maybe let's send that back a little, and I need to kind of change that back too. And then let's unsolo that center channel. And I can change how much information is sent into the surrounding channels by changing the direct push. Now, in order to hear better what's happening here, I probably need to kind of look to the side, and then essentially what you're going to hear is, if I'm having the direct push very low, most of the information is going to be in the left and right channels, which essentially means in the front. And as I'm increasing the direct push, it's going to send that to the back. So if I'm kind of changing to the side, you now hear the audio on the side. And if I'm changing the push, the signal is sent to the back. And it is always doing that in a way that is not changing the stereo downmix. And that is one of the most interesting things about Dano. But I actually wanted to create a Dolby Atmos master file and not just a 9.1.6 surround sound file. And for that reason, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to add the Dolby Atmos Composer Essentials from Fiedler Audio. Now I'm going to use that for two reasons. First of all, it is free. So if you don't have any Dolby Atmos software, just download that completely free and install it on the machine. And second of all, it's really all that we need. So why use something more complicated or more expensive if we can use the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer Essentials? So even if you have a well-established Dolby Atmos workflow, I would recommend for this particular application, just use the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer in its essential version, unless you have the full version. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the Dolby Atmos Composer plugin to our master track. Once again, the essentials version here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that ahead of Virtuoso, because Virtuoso, once again, is the plugin that we actually use in order to monitor the 9.1.6 output in binaural stereo with head tracking enabled. Now, a couple of things that we need to set in the Dolby Atmos Composer. The first thing is that we are going to work with a 9.1.6 composite. And if you have never worked with composites, the only thing that you really need to know is that a composite in Fiedler Audio speak is just a combination of bad channels, Atmos bad channels, and object channels, because the Dolby Atmos bad by default is only 7.1.4. And what Fiedler Audio did is they created this idea of composites, which combines the bad channels and adds a couple of objects that take the position of the remaining channels that are not in the Dolby Atmos bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch that over the composite to 9.1.6. And then I'm also going to change the monitoring settings from binaural to 9.1.6, because once again, we want to actually monitor 9.1.6, and we're actually going to do the binaural downmix through Virtuoso. And then the final thing I need to do is I need to add the Beam plugin. The Beam plugin is responsible for sending the audio from the tracks into the Dolby Atmos Composer. I need to add that to my track that hosts the stereo audio. So I'm going to add the Dolby Atmos Beam Essentials. Going to add that. And one final thing that I need to do is, because the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin usually can be a little bit confused about the way the channels are ordered. So what I usually kind of recommend is that you reset the objects. So we're going to reset them to 9.1.6. And as you can see, it has actually rearranged a couple of those channels. And once we've done that, everything should actually be set up correctly. What's happening now is that the audio is coming out of the stereo track, is going through Dano in plug data, is going to upmixed into 9.1.6, then sent into the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. From the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin, it is sent directly into the Dolby Atmos Composer. We can actually see here that the Dolby Atmos Composer has recognized this Beam plugin and has allocated the 16 channels. So this is the composite, consisting once again of out of 10 bad channels. So the first 10 channels are bad channels and 6 object channels. And it's then essentially kind of sending that out through the 9.1.6 bus. And finally, it is monitored by us through Virtuoso, which is a binaural renderer that is taking the head position of my headphones and converting that correctly in such a way that I have the impression of being in an actual Dolby Atmos 9.1.6 studio. So let's play the audio. And as before, I can play around with the position of the three-dimensional audio. So if I want to move that to the back, I can once again kind of push that to the back. And I'm once again going to hear that more if I'm actually kind of looking to the side, simply because once again the stereo downmix is going to null. So we are going to have very, very little change in the impression. But if we look to the side, we can actually, hear how the audio is moved from the front to the back. So here it's in the front. Here is essentially then moved to the back, and it's now surrounding me completely. And as I said in my last video, I can change how much information is sent into the head channels. I can change how much information of the diffuse signal is sent to the front or to the back. And I can fine-tune the three-dimensional positioning of my stereo audio in the three-dimensional space in such a way that once again the stereo downmix is always accurate. So let's say we are happy with the way we have changed the parameters in Dano. In my particular case, what I've done is I've actually pushed a lot of the direct signal into the sides, but that's perfectly fine. Kind of it sounded okay. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to export that into Dolby Atmos in order to create a Dolby Atmos master file. And then we're going to check out if that Dolby Atmos master file is actually a correct Dolby Atmos master file. Now the export is actually really simple. All I need to do is I need to tell the Dolby Atmos Composer where the audio starts and where it ends. And for that, I'm going to set the in points and the out points. Now the in point is already set to 0, so the audio starts at 0. And then I just need to tell the system where the audio ends. And what I'm going to do for that is I'm simply going to put the track head here to the end of the audio file. So It's a little hidden here. So here at the end, and I'm simply going to click on set out point, and that will essentially set the out point. And then I need to simply push the export button. And what that will do is it will open up a dialog and ask me where do I want to store that Dolby Atmos master file. And I'm going to store that on the desktop, and I'm going to call that test. So I'm going to simply press save. And now it's going to wait for Reaper to play the file. And there are really two ways on how we can do that. We can either simply play it, and then it will kind of record that more or less in real time, or we can also use the export function of Reaper. And for that, I'm simply going to go into the render options here, and I'm going to simply render that out. Now, one thing that's important to note here is that the sample rate has to be set to 48 kilohertz, because that is an Atmos requirement. If you don't set that, then the Fiddle Audio Dolby Atmos Composer is actually going to throw an error and will say that didn't work. So be sure, if you see an error, essentially that's most likely what happened, that you forgot to set the sample rate to 48 kilohertz. And then we are simply going to render that file. And as we are rendering that file, there are two things that are going to happen. First of all, the Dolby Atmos Composer is going to render out the Dolby Atmos master file, and Reaper is going to render out a binaural downmix through Virtuoso, which is going to be completely useless, because once again, we're actually recording the head tracking information of my head position, and that's going to be recorded in the output. But it's just going to do that. So what you can do is you can simply kind of delete that after it's done. And that's what we're going to do. So let's press render, and I'm going to overwrite that because I already did that before. And let's just kind of render that out. As you can see, the Fiddle Audio Dolby Atmos Composer is telling me essentially how much I've already rendered out. And let's just wait until it has finished. So it's now finished, and it has come back with the message that the export was successful. Once again, we've now created two files. One that's called test, and that is the actual Dolby Atmos master file. And the second one that was just rendered out by Reaper. And in order to make sure that we're not confusing the two, I'm going to simply delete the bounds that Reaper created. And the test file here is now my Dolby Atmos master file. So let's just check if that is actually a correct Dolby Atmos master file. And what I'm going to do for that is I'm simply going to load that up in the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's just open up the Dolby Atmos renderer here. And I'm just going to open up the master file, and let's see, that's the test here. We opened it up. And let's just play our audio and see if that's actually coming in correctly. Now, I'm now not having any head tracking information, obviously, because the Dolby Atmos renderer is just playing the Dolby Atmos master file without any knowledge about where my head position is. Now, and as you can see, and this is actually important, what the Fiddle Audio Dolby Atmos Composer did is it created a Dolby Atmos master file that contains a Dolby Atmos bed. These are the first 10 channels. And then in order to create the 9.1.6, it took 6 additional objects. These are objects 11 to 16. And added that to the mix in order to complete the 9.1.6 composite. And that essentially means that the Dolby Atmos master file is compliant with any requirements, because what distribution services usually want you to do is they want you to add objects so that you're actually using a fully developed Dolby Atmos master file. And because of the way we used objects here in order to complete the 9.1.6, this is actually perfectly fine and perfectly valid Dolby Atmos master file that you can submit to any distribution service such as DistroKid, and it should not cause any issues whatsoever. Now, some people have pointed out that this is not necessarily the way you should actually work with Dolby Atmos, because ideally you would kind of really use objects in the way they're supposed to be used, as objects, as sound objects in three-dimensional space. And this is to some extent true. However, be aware that what we have done here is we have actually taken an existing stereo track that we might not have the original session anymore, and we've converted it into Dolby Atmos in such a way that the stereo downmix is untouched. And I feel that that has its particular applications. Now, if you want to be a little bit more kind of creative with the way how you're working with three-dimensional information here, one thing that you can do, for example, is you can use a stem splitter and create individual stems out of your stereo mix, and then kind of use different instances of Dano in order to move the individual stems into different locations in three-dimensional space. And how that looks, I can actually show you because I've done that in a separate Reaper session. So let's open up that Reaper session and let's have a look. So what I've done here is I've simply taken the original track and I ran it through a stem separation service, and that stem separation service created 5 stems: a drum stem, a bass stem, a vocal stem, a guitar stem, which had a couple of steps here and there, and then another stem that included all the remaining information. And then instead of using Dano on one track only and sending it with the Fiedel Audio Beam Essentials plugin into the Fiedel Audio Dolby Atmos Composer Essential just from one track, I just did the same thing for all 5 tracks. And what I can do now is I can simply adjust the parameters, the Dano parameters for each stem individually, and thereby create a Dolby Atmos upmix that is a little bit more flexible. So I can, for example, say that only information out of the kick should actually go into the LFE, or only information out of the vocals should actually go into the center, and I can move certain things more to the back and other things more to the front, and I can therefore kind of massage the overall impression of our three-dimensional image of the audio track. So let's just have a brief listen. I probably need to, yeah.
Digital waves in stereo flight, transform them to dimensions of light. Atmos takes us higher tonight, preserving the essence, making it right.
Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description below. Our Discord is also the best place to connect with Sam Hawking, the developer of Dano, if you have any specific questions about the Dano plugin. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.